So we've looked at a few threat protection policies that protect our data, the data that's coming into the system. But sometimes there's network-based attacks that happen. For instance, a DDoS attack. Now we do have a policy that will help prevent DDoS attacks affecting your backend systems. That policy is called a spike arrest policy. Now, spike arrest policy can, depending on where it's attached, protect you from your targets from being overloaded from DDoS attacks or just what I call failure by success. If your API is just way too successful and the traffic is causing your backend to fail, it's a policy that's really good to even out the number of requests that are coming into your backend. What the spike arrest policy doesn't do is it's not an asynchronous method of queuing requests into the system. Requests that fail the spike arrest do drop. Also, one caveat of the spike arrest is that it does work on a rate and not what we call a bucket. And there we have two different policies. We have a quota policy and a spike arrest. And the way that they work is based off of either what we call a rate or a bucket. A quota works with a bucket. What a bucket means is that you set the quota to 100 requests per minute. It's going to start filling that bucket at a certain point in time. Once that bucket is completely full with requests, it will then start throwing errors until the time period rotates for that quota. Versus a spike arrest, it's going to determine the rate at which the requests are coming in, and if the rate exceeds the configured rate, it will start throwing errors until the next cycle hits. So when you're looking at rate, I could have a transaction rate of 5 requests per minute for a spike arrest. And I could trip that spike arrest by hitting 2 requests really fast because the rate is very low and it would be very easy to trip. Versus a quota where you would have 5 requests that would come in and then it would trip. Doesn't matter how fast you do those 5 requests, it'll trip at 5 requests. So when we're talking about spike arrest, it's really good to understand that it is limiting the rate of requests that's coming through. Now the effect of a spike arrest can be different based off of where you attach the policy. If you attach the policy to your pre-flow on the request, it's going to check all requests coming into that API at that base path. What that does is it actually will protect the Apigee infrastructure and the target infrastructure. Now, you can also protect particular targets by attaching the spike arrest to a particular target. Why would this make sense to do it that way? Well, you can have different targets that have different rates that they can manage. My typical advice for setting values for spike arrest are peak. When you do your load test, you know the peak of your transactional throughput, and then you come down, say, about 30% of that peak transactional throughput for your target server. You need to be careful because if you do attach it globally, you're talking about the number of servers that could possibly make those requests, and you should be careful in that scenario. So as a practical example, you can create a spike arrest policy really easily by selecting the spike arrest policy from the menu. We'll go into our API proxy and create a spike arrest policy. And I'm going to put my spike arrest policy up on the pre-flow. And I'm going to do it before my OAuth policy. Actually, I'm going to remove my OAuth policy. Now, when you create a spike arrest policy, it actually comes with 3 configurable fields: identifier, message weight, and rate. Rate is the most important, obviously. It's telling it that I want to support 300 TPS. The PS and the rate stands for per second. You can also do PM. I would highly recommend using PS as your rate. Typically, when you start talking about PM, just rarely do I see a scenario where that would ever make sense. Stay with the per second. That allows you to still smooth out your traffic without having scenarios where you're getting spike arrests firing when you don't necessarily want them to fire. With the identifier is a mechanism of adding business scenarios to your spike arrest. If, for instance, you wanted to have the threshold becomes less of a protection policy, is more of a business use case where you have a spike arrest set to a particular value for particular applications that are associated with particular products. Scenario A would be, product A has a rate of 100 TPS that they can do against this backend. Product B has 50 TPS that they can do against this backend. No longer is it a mechanism for protecting your backends, it's a mechanism for giving privileged access to your API. Message weight is a way of identifying API resources. Say you have an API resource that just acts like it's 3 or 4 times more potent on your backend than the other ones. So you want to count that as a heavier weight than other requests. And so you can increase the weight of in the policy to account for the processing that's going on the back end. In this case, we're going to remove both the message weight and identifier and just reference a rate of 300 PS. And as simple as that, we now have a spike arrest policy that will protect us against DDoS attacks